Do you hear me, Janos?
Yes, yes, I can
Oh,
hear you, Lou. I can
excellent.
hear you now.
Speak earlier. Apologize for the late entry. They're working on it. If you're going to, we were going to do an audio test for everyone. I think we're too late, so we should just get started. Do you think that you agree, Janos?
Yes, let's go ahead.
Okay. All right. One thing to be aware of, it looks like MeetEcho is providing very, very tight time constraints, both for entry and exit. I was just in a session that ended exactly at the end time to the second, just cut off everyone. So please be prepared for us to try to stick very tightly to the time and expect that we cannot run over at all. So I'm Lou Berger, I'm co-chair. I'm here with Janos Schwarkos as well as Ethan Grossman. Welcome to our our online IETF108 Detnet session. We have 50 minutes and we're going to try to keep things moving along pace. Next, this is an IETF. We have a note well that covers all our participation to these meetings. Basically, anything you say here becomes part of our permanent record and is a contribution to the IETF. If you're not familiar with it, please jump on that URL. If you're looking for URLs to slides, that was sent to the email list, and you should be able to click on that and move through that at your own pace. Next. One of the other things that we sent along is a link to Etherpad. We know that there's a new note-taking tool. We felt that the group was familiar with Etherpad, and we should just stick with it, particularly on this first day, and just because we know the kinks that exist with it, and so we're using Etherpad. Please jump on the link. You can find it in the email to the list, as well as this URL here, and on the various slide pages and agendas that have been distributed. MeetEcho is our tool that it's supposed to capture all the participants, and you should not need to enter your name for Blue Sheets, but if you feel like putting it at the end of the Etherpad, please feel free to do so. And the nice thing is then you're there and you can help us take minutes for the meeting. Next. The agenda has not changed since it was the second version was published. Next. This is something that I believe we mentioned at our last interim, but we thought it would be good to mention here. Is in this online world, we are trying to transition to the new mode of operating and not lose momentum because we're not meeting in person. Of course, we've always utilized the mailing list as our official way of gauging consensus for the working group, and nothing has changed there. But we wanted to make sure everyone in the working group is aware that there is a working group WebEx that's available for informal meetings among authors or for collaboration. And also, you can participants can ask for a formal virtual interim. And all it takes to get either of those things is to talk to the chairs. Just send to the Detnet chair alias if you'd like to either request something in an informal meeting or a formal virtual. Of course, in either case, those will be announced to the list, and everyone in the working group will be there. It will be available, or the WebEx will be there available for everyone to participate. We think that these types of meetings are really important to maintain progress while we're not meeting in person. Next. Keep in mind that we do ask for IPR disclosure confirmation of all contributors at both working group document acceptance as well as at publication. This is to ensure that everyone is aware of whatever IPR exists on the documents. This is a gating step at both acceptance and at for submission for publication. Next. So we've had some nice progress since the last meeting. We've had 3 RFCs published, so that's great news. We have 2 documents that are newly into the RFC editor queue. Those are the data plane framework document and the IP document. And we're hoping not far behind are the MPLS document, as well as the IP over MPLS and MPLS over IP. And these are the other documents listed. This is listed probably in the order that it'll go through the IESG. We did recently do an update on the Detnet MPLS document to align it to the changes that were requested by the IESG to get the Detnet IP document through. So because of that alignment, we're hoping it'll be a pretty quick pass through the IESG. But we have a nice set of documents that are ready to go and complete their process. Also up next are the TSN related data plane documents. We're going to start last call after this meeting, and it will end 2 weeks after the end of the IETF. So we're going to make sure that everyone has a good amount of time to review the documents, but be aware that last call on that is about to start. We have a couple of other documents on the agenda, and that's interesting. And we have one document that's not on the agenda. All right, next. As a reminder, we were recently rechartered, with the main addition to the work is bringing in the controller plane framework document and the ability to work on control plane. Next. We also updated our milestones, and we don't have a controller plane document quite yet, so it looks like we're already a little bit behind, and that's the reason for the asterisk. Sounds like someone wants to join in. Janos, is that you?
No, I don't want to say anything. I mean.
Okay. All right. Next. So I believe this is actually the last slide. So next up on our agenda, we have an update on the Yang configuration model. I'd like to ask the presenters to be aware that they have actually 12 minutes, because I get it a little early, and to really focus on what it is that they want from the working group. Whether it's just an update or if you have specific questions, please make it clear what is it that you want from the group on this. Again, from a time standpoint, about 12 minutes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'll start and I'll give an opportunity for others to talk. So first slide's just the contributors. Next slide, please. So the status of the draft is we've merged the 2 models from the last draft. So just a bit of history. The original model was not aligned with the flow data model. So we had 2 models. One was based off the flow data model, and what we have done is we have aligned those 2, and we've come back to one Yang model. And so we're continuing to work through the remaining changes into the signal model. And the other thing that I think we should do, because it's brought clarity, is publish the Yanglit config sample configurations. So we've been doing that in some of the slide decks, and we've been doing that on the outside, but we haven't brought it into the draft. I'd like to see that brought into the draft. We plan to, again, review the model and the add service sublayer aggregation. So we've got some aggregation inherently in the model, but we haven't quite aligned with what's in the data plane drafts and the flow model. And we need to go through and just check terminology and consistency for clarity. So we've continued to do that, but that's something that, you know, the work group can contribute to, is help us make sure that the terminology is the right thing for the Detnet working group. Okay, next slide, please. So that's just the history. We don't have to spend much on that. Next slide, please. So this is a pictorial diagram of what we've been trying to do. We've been trying to cover the data plane models that are in red there, and we have the various scenarios. We have IP, MPLS, and Ethernet, and how those are being modeled at the application layer, the service sublayer, and the forwarding sublayer. And we are still doing a limited subset as we do this, because it's quite large, and it's taken us a while to do that, but it's coming together, I think, now to follow this model and to be aligned with those drafts. Next model, next chart, please. So this is just a summary. We've seen this before of the flow model. I'm not going to go through this, but these attributes you will find now, the names and the pieces in the model as we're going along. Next chart, please. So we had a discussion in the group about what about the Detnet flows and how do those relate. And in my view, what I'd said is that from the MPLS model, a Detnet flow is basically, an app flow is realized by a single S label, and from the Detnet flow, it's one or more app flows. So it's actually this aggregation piece that we haven't put in to the service sublayer yet. So that's the next thing we're going to look at and see how that works in the model. Next chart, please. So this is just a high level of the various tree pieces. So there's the three pieces that we saw on the earlier model. You've got the application, layer, you've got the service sublayer, and you've got the forwarding sublayer, and this is how they relate together. So we've worked at getting a app layer that it can be bidirectional, but most of the other components are unidirectional. You can also have a unidirectional app flow, but we've reorganized the connection to the service sublayer to allow it to be, I think, a little bit clearer. Again, anybody that wants to comment on this organization, you're free to come to the weekly meetings or comment on the list. Next one, please. This is the service sublayer, and some of these pieces have different components based on whether you're a relay node, an endpoint, or a transit node. And so we've highlighted some of the aspects, whether you're a relay or whether you're an endpoint. Next chart, please. So for the forwarding sublayer, the same thing. We've got the tree and how it relates to the various other components there. Next chart, please. So this was a sample topology we've used to work through the model. It just shows some of the relationships of some of the labels. It doesn't show aggregation. We have to update this for aggregation. This is just a single flow, but it's using replication and elimination in that model. Next chart, please. This diagram, we've seen this before. This just represents what I talked about earlier, so that you have the application side and the various reference pointers. You have the service sublayer and the forwarding sublayer, and they're shown as unidirectional pieces. And the app flow can be, like I said, it can be single, it can be bidirectional, or it could be unidirectional pieces as well. And some of the relationships, et cetera, that of how many components can exist at each layer. Next chart, please. This is a sample of the Yanglit, the JSON output when configuring, and this one is just the application, I believe. No, it's got the service. It's got all pieces. So it's a single configuration of an edge node with an application, a service sublayer, and a forwarding sublayer. And this is what we have to put into the diagram. All right. Next chart. So our plan is to comment and review the current model for terminology consistency, adding the service sublayer aggregation, check that the flow model and the data plane models are consistent and continued with that Yanglit validation, and then a general cleanup, making sure that the document passes NITs and everything in the that's provided in there actually functions, so that you can test the XML, etc. And with that, I will open it up for comments from the other authors or anybody else. How much time do we have left?
A couple of minutes.
Okay. Any comments, questions? If not, we can get that back to
the working group done, or is this just you just want to make sure the working group is aware of where you stand?
Yeah, I mean, anybody right now can comment, but this is, yeah.
Okay. So we should move on?
Yep.
Thank you. Greg?
Thank you. Okay, so updating on MPLS OEM in Detnet MPLS. Next slide, please. This update includes there are two scenarios that we're looking for investigating MPLS Detnet domain OEM interworking with their TSN domain and Detnet IP domain, and enhanced security considerations section. Next slide. Two models for OEM interworking. The first is peering OEM model, and so on the diagram, what we're trying to capture is that, so in one domain, in Detnet MPLS domain, we have Detnet service and fate sharing the Detnet service OEM. And in TSN, in the peering model, again, so the Detnet MPLS service being mapped to TSN domain, and it has to have its own OEM that can be mapped in a boundary node that is in between, in the center, and then we can realize end-to-end OEM. Next slide. So in the tunneling model, it's in some regard simpler, because both service and related service OEM being tunneled through their neighboring domain, and thus one OEM provides you with the end-to-end. The tunneling model of OEM has some disadvantages. For example, so the tunnel obviously looks like a single hop entity, so that there is no visibility on state of the transit nodes that provide the transport for the tunnel. And obviously, the far end has to support this OEM that's being used in the Detnet MPLS domain. Next slide. So when integrating Detnet MPLS OEM with the TSN domain, we can use RFC 7023, which was for the pseudowire with the Ethernet domain, Ethernet pseudowire and mapping, and provided detailed information how their states can be mapped and signaled in the pseudowire. In addition, we can use DFD in Detnet MPLS. It's RFC 5884, but very conveniently, RFC 5880 defined the codes to be used for concatenated paths. So the two paths in TSN domain can be mapped into their Detnet MPLS BFD session as concatenated path, and then signaled when it's defect detected in TSN domain. It can be conveyed and signaled to the head end of BFD session in Detnet MPLS domain. Performance measurements, because we have two separate OEM domains, they will have to be performed separately in each domain, and then metrics that can be additive to use so that to assign and have credit limits and thresholds of metrics for each domain. As mentioned, the tunneling is another model of OEM interworking. Can we go to the next? Detnet MPLS to Detnet IP, it's simpler because, for example, we can have BFD in each domain. And again, as mentioned in a previous slide, signaling of concatenated path failure can be achieved using BFD. Performance measurement can be based on RFC 8762. It's a simple two-way active measurement protocol and its extensions. Or in Detnet MPLS domain, RFC 6374, delay and loss measurement in MPLS networks can be used. Next slide. For the security consideration that we added references to new documents because we haven't updated. And pointed to other concerns that related to LSP ping and BFD over pseudowire as also applicable to this specification. Next slide, please. Well, again, we always welcome your comments, suggestions, and have a discussion. Thank you.
Okay, do we have any questions? while we're waiting to see if anyone joins the queue, Greg, I noticed that the OEM IP document has not been updated. What's the plan there?
Yes. So we wanted to have this discussion on MPLS because it proposes the mechanism to support packet replication and duplicate elimination function, and we believe this is important. But while initiating and having this discussion on Detnet MPLS OEM, we'll be working on IP OEM and prepare it for the working group adoption poll.
Any comments, questions from anyone on the OEM work so far? Okay, then thank you very much, Greg. And maybe
sorry, I had an audio problem for a moment.
okay.
Greg, what's your plan for timeline for doing the update on the IP document, or do you think it's ready for adoption? I wasn't clear to me.
I need to, again, I switched from IPOAM, Detnet IPOAM to this work, so I need to go back, probably do it right away after the meeting, and then I'll reach out to you if we need some time to prepare it further, or if we believe that it's effectively ready for adoption poll, then I'll let you know. So right after the meeting, I'll get to that.
Great. So we'll see a comment on next steps on the list.
Yes.
Thank you. So next up, I think we have Fabrice, who's going to talk to us a little bit about what's happening in RAW with OAM. The chair has actually asked for this to be presented here today because we think that there's a lot of good discussion in this document, which is completely generic to any Detnet network. And so from our chair standpoint, we're looking at this as potentially being brought into the OEM work that Greg was just talking about.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So that's a joint work with Georgios and Greg, who presented the last talk. Next slide. And during the last IETF, we discussed during the working group, on the raw working group, but we had a very generic document. And actually, some of these details were very specific to wireless networks. So that's the purpose of the novel version of the drafts, version 2 and 3, in which we tried to address only the specific aspects for networking. So typically for everything which is specific to wireless networks, we will discuss about that on next Thursday for the raw working group. And after our discussion, we concluded that perhaps it may be interesting to have one part of this document which concerns the generic aspects of OEM features and which may be of interest for Detnet. So that's typically the objective of this presentation, to present what we did so far with Greg and Georgios. Next slide, please. So the structure of my presentation is first operation, administration, and then I will conclude with maintenance program. Next slide. For the operation, that's the job. The job is to keep the network up and running. So we have to maintain the connectivity to verify that connectivity is okay for any flow, so control plane, and also for a specific flow, since we have some dedicated resources for some specific Detnet flows. So we have to adapt some very popular tools such as ping and trace routes to work in this situation. Basically, we have to consume the resources which are dedicated for data flows to also piggyback the control packets or the control information that is used by these tools. We have to detect and to verify that no fault occurs in the network. The problem is that we may collect a very large amount of statistics, which may be heterogeneous or not. So we have to design some mechanisms to aggregate these metrics and to be able to understand where the fault occurs in the network. And the challenge is basically in to have these OEM tools that work well, that use the data the resources for data packets, but without disturbing them. So we have a kind of cohabitations, which is to our mind quite challenging. Next slide, please. For the administration, that's keeping track of the resources and how they are used in the network. So we have to collect a large amount of metrics. So for wireless networks, we have a clear view of what we should collect, so such as SSI, the signal strength, the radio consumption for every radio channel, this kind of stuff. For Detnet, it may be something quite different, such as the queuing delay, the packet losses, the distribution of our rewards, to verify that everything goes correctly. And the challenge is still to not disturb the data packets. So should we insert some flags in the packets? Should we piggyback some information, some control packets inside the payload? That's an open question to our mind. And it also depends on the faults that we have to detect. For instance, for how still we have to detect that something goes wrong for a given radio channel. So we have to collect statistics per radio channel, but it may be also per link, per circuit, device, to be able to identify each type of fault in the network. And we have also collect worst case metrics, since we are quite convinced that the average value may often not be representative enough. So we have to collect the distribution rather than these very synthetical values. So the minimum inter-packet time or the compliance of the flow with the specifications, for instance. Next slide, please. And last but not least, that's to facilitate the upgrades and repair, since we have multiple paths because we have a fault-tolerant topology, so we are exploiting multiple independent paths. So more than availability, that's the fact that we have several paths that are active in parallel. So we have to propose the mechanisms to replicate the packets at the right places and to eliminate the duplicates. So how we should inject the packets or not. Logging, that's more tracing. So when we have a data packet which is received, we should be able to know which path has been used for this specific packet. That's much easier to make a diagnostic if something goes wrong, or if we make some statistics per path, per circuit. We have also to take care of resources that are reserved along the path to deal with failures, and probably we have also to implement some soft transition mechanisms so that when we detect a fault, we are able to reconfigure the network while maintaining the network consistent globally. And we, after discussion internally and externally, we are quite convinced that this maintenance feature is probably common to Detnet, and that's not something we see specific to RAW. The mechanisms should be in common because we don't have any very specific change in wireless networks. Next slide, please. So the next step is, okay, is this points, are these points of interest for Detnet? What will be the purpose, which direction we should explore? Volunteers are much more welcome for contributing, criticizing, whatever. So yeah, that's an open discussion now. Open to questions, comments, or critiques.
So have you thought about how you would split the material between Detnet and law? I mean, obviously, anything that's really radio specific belongs in law, right?
Actually, we have removed from draft all what we thought that it was generic. So now we don't have any document which is ready, which is specific to Detnet or generic enough. We only focused on the wireless networks up to now. But before going in this direction, I guess it would be great if it's of interest for Detnet, or if this is too generic. That's an open question.
Okay, we can always look to your co-author, Greg, who just spoke, to see if he's willing to take that generic piece and bring it back into Detnet, because that's the text that we thought was worthwhile, either in to bring into the existing documents or as a maybe even an OEM framework.
Yeah.
I see David Black in the queue.
I like the idea of a generic framework, particularly as we've got multiple data planes in Detnet. Just want to sort of caution that we need to be careful about getting overly enthusiastic at this stage of limiting participants and signing up for half a dozen drafts. That would not be a good path forward. But I do like the idea of having sort of one general, this is what OAM has to do. Here are the crucial services. Now see these other two drafts for how to map them into the data planes.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. Maybe.
Okay. Go ahead.
Yes, so I also like the idea of having the .NET OAM framework draft and similarly to the data plane, and then we would have an MPLS OAM, or we have an MPLS OAM, IP OAM, and the working group could add the wireless specific parts to the generic OAM.
Okay, thank you. Rick is in the queue.
Hi, Rick Taylor. So I'm with my chair of RAW hat on. I'm really pleased to hear people saying this, because in conversation with Lou and Janos and Eve about this, we came to the same conclusion, that we thought there was a lot of value in this document that was generic enough to be held in Detnet if it could be absorbed into a generic OEM document. And we're very happy to keep the raw specific parts within the raw working group. But I also agree with David's point about not generating 1,001 documents just for our own entertainment.
Yeah.
Okay, looks like there's support for the notion of a generic framework. I'd say if you are willing to work on that, add your name into chat saying you would like to work on it, and let's see if we can get some people to self-organize. We do have some common authors, notably Greg, and maybe Greg, you can try to self-organize and see if we can come back with a document. And throw your name into the chat session. If you click that little red button that has next to the list of people, you should be able to type, and then you can see each other. I saw one person jump in the queue and jump out. I don't know if there's anything anyone else wants to add. Anything?
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
George here. Sorry if there's a background noise. Just to make sure if I understood well, the idea will be to work on generic document for the Detnet, and then we will have the specific document for the raw working group, right?
That's what I understood here for myself.
I think I misheard part of what you said, but I think you were saying that there would be a generic part in Detnet and a raw specific one in raw. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Okay. Yes. So we all agree, I think.
Yeah. Thanks.
So probably the next step will be with Greg and Georgios and the possible contributors, additional contributors. We try to identify that the aspects which are generic enough to fit in Detnet, and we'll submit this draft to the mailing list to see if it fits well the interest of the working group. That's okay?
Yeah, you just submit it as an internet draft and then bring it and then point out to the working group that it's there. You don't have to run it by the working group. Drafts are cheap. So please publish it, and then you can all see it. Thank you all so much. I think we're ready to move on to the next topic, which is control plane.
Thank you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you. Please go ahead.
Okay. Hi, this is Xue Song, and I will introduce our progress in the document of Detnet controller plan framework. Next slide, please. Here is the background and the purpose of this document. Actually, there are other documents have some contents about the Detnet controller plan. For example, the Detnet architecture draft and the Detnet data plan framework. In this document, we want to compile all Detnet controller plan requirements in one place, and also provide an overview of possible control plan architecture considerations, and also try to give some guidance for the following controller plan work, especially after the recharter. We think there will be a lot of more work about the controller plan for Detnet. And next slide, please. Here is the update for this version of the draft. We have fixed some comments from both the working group and also the chairs. We have updated the terminologies in the draft. For example, we changed the hybrid control plan to combined control plan. And also we have removed some expired references and also some editor modification. And we have a new co-author, Balas, and thanks for his contribution to this version of the draft. Next slide, please. In the following slides, I would like to introduce some contents of the draft. The first one is the control plan requirement. This part align with the contents in the Detnet data plan framework. And I classify these requirements into three classes. The first one is the general requirement. For example, support dynamic creation, modification, and deletion of Detnet flows, and also support Detnet flow aggregation, deaggregation, flow initiation requests to originate in an system, and also scale to handle the number of Detnet flows expected, provision flow identification information at each of the nodes along the path. These are all general requirements. And also we have some requirements for service sublayer. For example, support the service protection, such as packet replication, elimination, and ordering. Also some forwarding sublayer requirements, for example, the advertise, static, and dynamic node, and the link resources. Also explicit path and resource allocation, and maybe some queue control technologies should also be considered. Next page, please. Here is some requirements for management plan. For example, monitor the performance of Detnet flows and nodes to ensure that they are meeting required objectives, both proactively and on demand. Also support Detnet flow continuity check and connectivity verification functions, and support testing and monitoring of packet replication, duplicate elimination, and the packet ordering functionality in Detnet domain. Next page, please. Here is that the control plan architecture. In this document, we have defined three types of control plan architecture. The first one is the distributed control plan, and the second one is fully centralized control plan, and the third one is the combined control plan. The dashed line in the picture is the unit between the end system and Detnet domain, which may not be included in the current version of the draft. And the arrow between Detnet node shows the signaling protocol may be defined in the picture, and the arrow between the controller and the Detnet node means that there will be some configuration from the controller and to configure the Detnet device in the Detnet domain. Next slide, please. Here is some control plan considerations. for example, we should consider how to implement explicit paths in control plan. For example, path computation, path establishment, and strict or loose paths. Also, resource reservation, for example, resource allocation, device configuration, and packet replication, elimination, or ordering function should be supported. Actually, these functions may not be independent from each other. For example, when we compute the Detnet paths, we should also consider whether there are enough resources for a particular Detnet flow. Next slide, please. Here is the management plan overview. In the OEM for performance monitoring, there will be active performance monitoring and passive performance monitoring. And also OEM for connectivity and fault defect management should also be considered. And next slide, please. In the next version, we plan to add some gap analysis in the document, which will include maybe some considerations about if we want to implement Detnet in a network, what is the gap will be there if we just use the existing control plan protocols or models. If there should be some new extensions or protocols to be defined, maybe there will be some analysis in this document also. And we think this document is mature and maybe it is ready for working group adoption. Okay, that's all.
Sure. And 2-minute warning. Greg, I think you're muted.
Yeah, but
I hear you.
Oh, you can hear me? Okay, thank you. Can you clarify, please, when you discuss OEM, are you referring to the management or maintenance?
I think both of them should be considered, because in the definition of the Detnet controller plan, it both contain the control plan and the management plan. And in the management plan, we in our original document, we intend to cover the OEM considerations. So I think both of them should be included.
Well, there was historically some confusion what M stands for in OEM acronym, and it stands for maintenance. And maintenance is not the management plane function. The results can be exposed because, again, the management usually is what's configurable, what's controllable, what's exposed. Their maintenance, as was mentioned and explained in a previous presentation by Fabrice, is a different entity. So I think that it needs to be really clarified why you think that OEM is part of the management plane.
I think terminology clarification is necessary here. I agree, but whether OEM should be included in the management plan, maybe some comments or suggestions from working group is also necessary, because for this document, what we are trying to do is just to cover the controller plan defined in the architecture. If in the architecture, the controller plan cover the OEM, no matter management or maintenance, I think it should be included in the document. If the architecture shows that not all of the OEM parts should be included in the Detnet controller plan, maybe we should put it. Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but they're likely to cut us off in the next 20 seconds if the experience of the last session holds. So
yes.
please discuss this on the list. It's a great topic, and I think distinguishing the control from the actual OAM, the control of OAM versus actual OAM, is a great place for the framework documents and this control plane document to be clarified. And we'll continue on the list.
Yes.
And once this is resolved, we'll talk about adoption also on the list.
Okay.
So thank you all. We're like 5 seconds over, and we might get cut off at any moment. We really appreciate your participation in this online IETF108 Detnet session, and look forward to working with you on the list. And again, all should feel free to request virtual meetings if they think that it would be helpful. And with that, the session is closed.